Most of the time we trust science. We trust that the people running experiments have our best interests in mind, and that the search for knowledge makes the world safer, smarter, and more humane. But throughout history, research hasn't always lived up to that ideal. In fact, some of the most influential discoveries we've ever made came from studies that pushed bent or completely erased the boundaries of ethics. So today, we're going to explore the experiments that forced the world to ask a difficult question: how far is too far? And more importantly, what these cases reveal about human nature power and the fragile line between understanding people and hurting them. This is not a horror story. It's a story about curiosity, authority, and the choices that define the future of science, and the uncomfortable truth behind the most controversial experiments ever conducted. We like to believe that science is always a force for good, that researchers are guided by reason, compassion, and a desire to understand the world so we can improve it. But history tells a more complicated story. Because when curiosity mixes with authority, and when the desire to gain knowledge grows faster than the guardrails protecting human dignity, the result has often been the same experiments that cross the line. Not because the people involved were monsters, but because they believed the ends justified the means. Today, we're going to look at some of the most controversial experiments in modern history. Not to sensationalize them, but to understand what they reveal about human nature power and the fragile boundary between research and harm. Because the real lesson isn't just what happened, but how easily it could happen again if we stop paying attention. Let's begin with a question that seems simple, but is disturbingly hard to answer. If you were allowed to run any experiment in the world with no rules, no limits, and no oversight, how far would you go? Most people would say not very far. But the truth is that ordinary people in ordinary settings have gone much further than they ever imagined, often with very little pressure. And the experiment that revealed this most clearly began in a basement at Yale University. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to answer a question haunting the world after World War II. How could so many ordinary individuals participate in a system that caused immense suffering? Were they evil, or were they simply following orders? Milgram designed a study to find out, and the results shocked everyone, including him. Volunteers were told they were helping test a new learning method. In reality, they were being watched for something much simpler: whether they would obey an authority figure, even if it meant harming someone else. Participants were instructed to deliver increasingly powerful electric shocks to a learner every time he answered a question incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the participants didn't know that. What mattered was how far they were willing to go. Most people predicted that only a tiny fraction would continue past moderate shock levels. In reality, 2/3 of participants pushed the dial all the way to the end, to a level labeled danger severe shock. Many were visibly distressed. Some trembled, sweated, or begged the experimenter to stop. But the majority still continued, simply because a man in a lab coat told them calmly and firmly that the experiment required it. Milgram's experiment revealed something uncomfortable. People don't need to be cruel to commit harmful acts. They just need a situation that nudges them toward obedience. The power isn't in the individual, it's in the context. And the more structured and authoritative that context is, the more extreme the obedience becomes. But this wasn't the only experiment that showed how environments shape behavior. About a decade later, another psychologist, Philip Zimbardo, set out to understand what happens when people are placed in roles that carry extreme power differences. His study became known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. The setup was simple. 24 college students were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards in a simulated prison built in the basement of Stanford University. The participants were instructed to act out their roles, but the transformation that followed was far more extreme than anyone predicted. Almost immediately, the guards began enforcing their power with increasing harshness. They issued arbitrary rules, performed random punishments, and escalated their control in ways that felt less like a study and more like a descent into real abuse. Meanwhile, the prisoners began showing signs of emotional breakdown, passivity, and despair, despite knowing on some level that this was only an experiment. What made the Stanford Prison Experiment shocking wasn't the cruelty itself. It was the speed. Within 48 hours, people who had never shown aggressive tendencies transformed into harsh enforcers. And people who had never been victimized before slid into helplessness. The experiment, intended to last 2 weeks, was terminated after 6 days. Many aspects of the study were later criticized, including Zimbardo's involvement, the lack of proper controls, and the psychological pressure placed on participants. But its core message remains unsettling. You don't need to be a certain kind of person to behave abusively in a position of power. You just need the role, the freedom to enforce it, and the belief that someone above you approves. But the experiments we've discussed so far share one critical feature: the participants technically agreed to be there. They didn't know the full truth, and the ethics were questionable, but they signed up. There is another category of research that crosses an even darker line: studies where the subjects never consented at all. Perhaps the most infamous example is the Tuskegee Syphilis Study in the United States. From 1932 to 1972, hundreds of African American men with syphilis were recruited under the promise of free health care. But they were never told they had the disease. And even worse, they were never treated, not even after penicillin became the widely accepted cure. The researchers weren't studying how to help them. They were studying what happens when the disease is left untreated. For 40 years, the participants were monitored as they grew sicker, passed the infection to partners, and in many cases died, all while being reassured they were receiving proper medical attention. The study wasn't stopped because the investigators had a moral awakening. It ended because a whistleblower exposed it to the press. Tuskegee is perhaps the clearest example of science being used to exploit rather than enlighten. It didn't involve a moment of obedience or a sudden shift in behavior. It was a long, deliberate process rooted in racism neglect and the belief that certain people's lives were worth less than the pursuit of scientific knowledge. Its legacy still shapes public distrust in medical systems today. At this point, a pattern begins to emerge. The problem isn't just the experiments themselves, it's the assumptions behind them. Assumptions that authority is trustworthy, that people in power won't abuse it, that the pursuit of knowledge is always worth the cost, and that the people being studied are simply subjects, not human beings, with rights, dignity, and agency. These assumptions held for decades until society finally decided they were unacceptable. In response to these and other cases, a new framework for research ethics emerged. It was built on 3 pillars, each designed to prevent the kinds of abuses seen in Milgram, Stanford, and Tuskegee. The first pillar is informed consent. People must know what they're agreeing to. Not vague promises, not half-truths, full, honest information. If a study involves risk, participants deserve to understand that risk clearly without manipulation or pressure. The second pillar is minimizing harm. Risk can't always be eliminated, but it must always be justified, and only when the potential benefits are meaningful and the harm is as small as possible. If an experiment relies on deception, the deception must not expose participants to real danger. The third pillar is the right to withdraw. At any moment, for any reason, participants must be free to leave. No guilt, no persuasion, no consequences. This rule exists because many of the worst outcomes in past studies happened when people felt trapped, obligated, or socially pressured to continue. Today, every legitimate research institution is required to have an ethics review board, an independent group, whose only job is to question, challenge, and approve studies before they begin. They exist to protect participants, yes, but also to protect science from undermining itself. Because when research harms people, trust collapses. And without trust, nothing else works. But here's the uncomfortable twist. Ethical systems are only as strong as the people who enforce them. Rules can be bent, loopholes can be exploited, cultures can change, and pressure can build, especially in areas where the frontier of knowledge is expanding faster than the regulations surrounding it. Artificial intelligence, genetic editing, brain-computer interfaces, behavioral manipulation in online platforms. These fields may one day produce the same ethical dilemmas that psychology, medicine, and social science faced decades ago, only on a larger scale. And the question becomes, will we recognize the warning signs in time, Or will we convince ourselves that the next breakthrough is worth crossing boundaries for? The lesson from history is simple. The greatest danger is not a specific experiment or a specific researcher. The danger is the belief that it can't happen again. Because every one of the experiments we discuss today was justified at the time by people who believed they were doing something important, even necessary. And that's why ethical boundaries aren't fixed objects. They're living agreements that society must reaffirm constantly. Science is one of humanity's greatest achievements. But science without ethics isn't progress. It's power without responsibility. And power without responsibility has always been dangerous. So the question we should be asking today isn't, how could they do those experiments in the past? The real question is, what experiments are we willing to say no to now, so we don't repeat the same mistakes later? Because the line between discovery and harm is not drawn once. It's drawn every day by the choices we make and by our willingness to insist that knowledge is valuable, but never more valuable than the people whose lives it touches. If there's one lesson we can take from these experiments, it's this: ethical boundaries don't protect themselves. They rely on people, researchers, institutions, and the public to question decisions, challenge authority, and refuse to let progress come at the cost of human dignity. Because science moves fast. Faster than laws, faster than oversight, faster than we sometimes expect. And the next big breakthrough in AI genetics neuroscience, or something we haven't even imagined yet, will bring its own ethical questions. Questions we'll need the courage to answer before the experiments begin, not after the damage is done. Thank you for watching. If you found this breakdown helpful, insightful, or thought-provoking, consider subscribing for more clear, calm explanations on the ideas shaping our world. And as always, stay curious, but stay critical.